close friend, John Bagnasco. Where are we doing?
Right behind you.
John is an extremely experienced rosarian. He is an author. He hosts a radio show, and he has actually hybridized several roses himself. He's been in the gardening industry over 54 years. He's published several books on gardening. In fact, if you ever get a chance to come to his house, he has a new house in Balboa. And he has this one room just for books. And it's mostly gardening books. He was the regional manager and buyer for Armstrong Garden Centers. He became the senior editor and radio personality for Garden Compass. He's president of Garden America, which is a national radio show. He is a rose breeder and has introduced over a dozen roses. He taught horticulture at Palomar College and San Diego State University. But currently his biggest passion is he's president of the Coastal Rose Society. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that one. It's usually a little bit up north from us. And he is also chairman of the Save the Roses Foundation. And the concept behind this, many of you have heard about our Save the Roses effort with Cal Coastal, is his passion is to rescue and propagate roses that otherwise would be lost in the world. In some cases, he has traveled to France or Japan or Germany or England and rescued perhaps the last rose of its kind. And it's really a fascinating passion that John has for this, and so he'll talk to you more about that. His idea is to preserve the genetics of rare roses and unusual rose varieties so that they can be returned to home gardens like ours. We actually have, and so he coordinates the auction of those roses to raise money for that effort. And this year we're partnering with him at our Rose Society. Our Rose Show and the Cal Coastal Auction will be together in a parallel. So it's really fascinating the science behind what he does. So I would like to introduce John Bagnasco, a profound rosarian.
Does this work? Can everybody hear me? Okay. If everyone gives Deborah $5 before you leave, I think you guys can get a first-class sound system. So, Elaine did tell you what my passion is, and my passion is saving varieties that are in danger of extinction. And the reason it's my passion is that I think that breeding roses is just another art form. Instead of using stone or paint, it's using living material. And the history behind some of the rose varieties is amazing. And hopefully we'll go through some of that tonight. And I always promise when I give a talk that if you listen, you'll learn something you did not know before you came here. I don't promise you'll care, but you definitely will learn something. So tonight's presentation is Lost, Found, and Still Around, the Proposition of Saving Rose Varieties in the 21st Century. The gentleman in the third row there is my good friend, Dr. Joel Ross, and the reason I am involved in saving roses is because of Joel. We'll begin this year will be our 22nd annual auction, and it's 100% because of his efforts that we are still doing this. Joel and I are standing on either side of a photo of Ivy Bowden, who bequeathed a number of dollars to the Coastal Rose Society to save roses. He gave us approximately $10,000 to use in saving roses, and the way we as Elaine explained, the way we get money in addition to that is through our auction, by introducing these roses back to the public. So far, we haven't been able to spend the 10,000 and actually have about 4,000 over what he gave us. But Joel and I are trying as hard as possible to spend it. So why do we have to save roses? Where are all these roses disappearing to? Well, if you look at these nurseries and mail order companies, Vintage Gardens, Jackson and Perkins, Almost Heaven Roses, The Uncommon Rose, Weeks Roses, Miniature Plant Kingdom, Two Sisters Roses, Euro Desert Roses, Pickering Nurseries, Carlton Roses, they all have something in common. And what's in common is they've all gone bankrupt or out of business in the last 20 years. There's gardens that are repositories for rare roses. There's the San Jose Heritage Rose Garden. Cliff Orient had 4,000 roses in Morongo Valley. The Fineschi Rose Garden in Italy. The Columbus Park of Roses, which is in Columbus, in Ohio, and used to be the home of the American Rose Society before they moved to Shreveport. All of those places, those public gardens, are having trouble maintaining their roses, and those are places we want to work with. I found this quote I wanted to share that was from Thomas Healy, who was, I think he was either a general or an admiral, and he said, "Don't strew me with roses after I'm dead. When death claims the light of my brow, no flowers of life will cheer me. Instead, you may give me roses now." What a great sentiment, especially for all the new people here that have one or two roses or none. I started out with one rose and now have 1,500. So it's just a warning. The Sacramento Historic City Cemetery was involved in collecting mainly found roses, but a lot of old garden roses. And it was a beautiful, I don't know has anyone here ever been there? It's just a spectacular, or was a spectacular place to look at. That picture up there is a shot of what the garden or the cemetery used to look like before they took all the roses out. So roses that have been there for 100 years have been cut back to knee-high or just ripped out altogether. A lot of those roses didn't exist anywhere else, so we worked with them to try to save a lot of those before they were destroyed. By the way, anytime you see double quotes around a rose, that means that it was found. It's not a rose that was registered, but was actually found somewhere, and it was given this provisional name. So the Abbott and Burns family rose came from the Sacramento Rose Garden, and it was originally carried from Arkansas to California on a covered wagon. And it's a little miniature roses, and back in the mid-1800s, those roses were known as Lawrenceanas. And just to show you how fragile miniature roses are, there were hundreds of Lawrenceanas during the mid-1800s, and by the end of the 19th century, they were all gone. This is one that survived, and they used to call them dooryard roses, and they would plant them next to a back door where, when the housewife was dumping dishwasher or some type of water, she could put it on the rose, and she could see it while she was going about her housework. This rose is always in bloom, 12 months out of the year. The roses are no bigger than about an inch, but it's one of those roses that makes you smile just to look at it. Another rose that's going to be in the auction is Copperopolis Bar. Found roses usually have creative names like what was the building next to what they were found. Copperopolis Bar is a really deep pink rose. It's got hundreds of petals and a wonderful fragrance. If your rose society has found roses as a category, this is a great rose to be entered in exhibition, is that class. I know that our rose show in the fall will have found roses. So bid on that during the auction. Benny Lopez is another great rose. Some of you might know Ingrid Wobblehorse, who used to be, it was a Ventura Rose Society, Joel?
Yeah.
She was a member of that. And she found this rose, and it was a rose that Benny Lopez had grown for 50 years. And it's amazing because of the color changes depending on where it is. It's disease resistant. He collected it in the 50s, and then Ingrid found it at his place in 2005. This also will be in the auction. The Pulich Children has got a great story behind it. Has anyone grown this particular rose? This was found on the cemetery plot of two children. One died when he was 1.5 years, and the other died when he was 4 years old. I won't read you that up there, but if you want to read it, you can find out the whole history about it. But the interesting thing about this rose is that this rose actually found its family instead of the family finding its rose. The rose was being offered for sale at a Sacramento cemetery rose sale, and Robin Pulich saw online that this rose was being offered for sale and thought, this is my name. And her family had immigrated from Croatia. She had never heard the Pulich family name used anywhere else except in her family. But she didn't know that anyone before 1900 from her family had come to the United States. Well, she found out through a little bit of research that not only had her family come to the United States, but that the man whose children that was in the cemetery, that was actually her grandfather's brother. So she was able to find out more about her nursery. It turned out that, more about her ancestry. And then it turned out that her relatives were actually responsible for growing a lot of roses in the Stockton area, and that the roses that were in the cemetery and on the Pulich children's grave might have actually come from their nursery. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Secret Garden Musk Climber. If anyone has grown the rose Sally Holmes, it's a fantastic rose, but after an initial bloom, it kind of stops. It'll bloom sporadically. Secret Garden Musk Climber is like a perpetual blooming Sally Holmes. It's never without flowers. You can see on the picture below how many grow in a cluster. This was a found rose. It's completely disease-free, so you should be able to grow it just about anywhere else. But this was found on a homestead near Jamestown. After it was collected, they went back a few years later, and that rose that was there had been bulldozed. There was no sight of it anymore. So had someone not saved it, that rose would have been lost forever. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to try to preserve some of these roses. Now, a lot of you know Bob Martin, who was the former president of the American Rose Society. And Bob was a great supporter of our Save the Roses auction. He probably gave presentations for over 15 years. And about 2 days before he died, he actually came to my house to pick up the roses he had won in the auction. And I was able to spend an hour and a half with him discussing old roses, discussing the roses he had bought, the roses that he had donated to the auction. And I had a great time. I was saddened when we lost him, but I was so happy that I was able to spend an hour and a half with him talking about roses. So we thought that it would be fitting for this auction to feature roses from Bob's garden. So we worked with Elaine and Beth, who who worked with his wife Donna on putting the home up for sale, but they had to divest themselves of the roses that were in the garden. So a lot of help went into moving the roses, trying to preserve them, to save as many as they could. So Bill and Elaine have at their home a number of roses that will be in the auction. They're not all rare, but some of them are, and I'll go over just a few that'll be in the auction. When you go to CCR Roses auction, CCRS auction.com, CCRSauction.com. In the next 2 weeks, I'll have a list of all the roses that are going to be in the auction. If you see an asterisk after the name of a rose, that'll mean that particular plant came from Bob's garden. So if you want something to remind you of Bob and everything he meant to the rose world, that's something to plan on. This was a picture that Bob took of his garden as the beds in the center were just being planted. They put a lot of David Austin roses in those areas. This was a sport of Chihuly that Bob found, and Chihuly, as you can see, this is Chihuly, but this is on the same bush. So he registered this sport as Jerry Mathers. And Jerry Mathers came to the national convention that we had here in San Diego, and the person who won that rose that was in the auction got their picture taken with Jerry, and he gave him an autographed picture. So that's one to look for, one of Bob's roses. Angel Grace is a rose that Bob bred himself. It was named for his granddaughter, Evangeline Grace. And it's kind of a simple rose, but everything about it is happy. It's clean, it's disease-free. It's a sport of Anne Morrow Lindbergh and Julia Child, which is something that Bob used a lot in his crosses, and we'll have this for sale. Ruth Tiffany was bred by Bob Martin in 2018. Some of you might know Ruth. The rose right here is really pretty, but it's not in a lot of gardens, and it's one that we want to get into gardens if we can. So use the auction as an opportunity to get Ruth Tiffany. Zion Rose is a mini flora from Jim Sproul, and sometimes you look at photography and you think, you know, that's Photoshop. This is exactly what this rose looks like. It's just a beautiful rose, and it was named after a little girl whose name was Zion Rose, and she had been diagnosed with a terminal brain disease before some friends came to Jim and said, you know, we want a rose to remember her by. So Jim offered this one here. So the little girl passed away in November of 2015, but the rose is still there. A great exhibition rose. I'm sure people have shown this, right? If not, I know they're going to. Here's a few more that Bill and Elaine have at their home that will be in the auction. Kiko-san, which is a rose bred by Louis Decimero. Brown Velvet, which is a russet brownish rose by Sam Magrini. It's brown in cool weather. In the summer, it's bright orange. If you're in a hot area, it'll be bright orange. Otherwise, brown. And then Elfin Glow is a miniature that if you ever have a micro mini category in your rose show, it almost always wins. It's really a good one. And all these roses are not that readily available. So to get a rose that's not readily available and from Bob's yard would be great. These two roses I'm excited about. This one called It's a Keeper, I've never seen anywhere except in Bob's yard. And it's not even on Help Me Find. I posted it to Help Me Find. Hopefully they will put it up. But I was able to find information on the Old for Love of Roses website. So Elaine, do you guys have this rose? Where's Elaine? Do you have it?
No, we don't ourselves.
You don't have it yourself. Elaine has every Dave Bang rose in the world, so if Elaine didn't have this, it's really one to bid on. And then this rose here called Angel Kisses, I think has great exhibition potential. Dave calls it a floribunda, but in a 1-gallon can for me, it's had a bloom as big as any hybrid tea. So I don't know if the class will ever change, but right now it's a beautiful exhibition rose. Flash Night is a florist rose that Dave Bang used to breed most of his roses. So it's a parent of most of his striped roses. And it was a florist rose that came from Interplant in the Netherlands. And Bob donated one to our last auction. And in our auction, if you're bidding online, you're allowed to put in a reserve for the highest amount you want to go. That doesn't mean we put that bid in unless someone else goes over what you've bid. So the reserve for this rose in our auction was $580. It ended up going for like $370 or something like that, which is still a lot of money. But one of these will be in the auction, and I can almost guarantee you won't have to pay $300 for it. But what you will pay, I don't know. La Roserie du Désert if ever I pronounce a French name wrong, Sue Streeper can just raise her hand and you can go to her afterwards and find out the correct way to pronounce it. But they were in the south of France, not too far, I think only an hour from Barcelona. And we were interested in getting a lot of roses from Europe that didn't exist in the United States. But the USDA changed immigration restrictions, so you're not allowed to bring roses from anywhere in the world except 5 countries. And from those 5 countries, if the rose diameter is thicker, the stem diameter is thicker than a pencil, you can't bring it in, period. So all the roses available in Europe were grafted, which meant you can't bring any rose in. So John and Becky Hook had a son-in-law that lived in Del Mar, a son and daughter-in-law that lived in Del Mar. And I talked to them and they said, you know what, we would take cuttings and root roses for you and then ship them to you. So they were able to do that, and we've been working with them for the last 3 years, and right now working on maybe one final shipment. They've sold their nursery, but they still have a few roses left for us. But because of them, we were able to bring in over 100 roses that don't exist in the U.S. This rose here is Princess Marie Dagmar. And John Hook wanted to get this. It's a tea rose. He wanted to get it and found out there was only one plant left, and it was at the Fineschi Garden in Italy. So he made a special trip from France to Italy to get this rose for his own collection. And he brought it back, rooted it, and then he had the rose available. But the original rose that was in Fineschi died. So had he not made that trip to Europe, we wouldn't have this rose at all. And we did have this in our auction, the last auction that we had. This rose here has got a San Diego connection. And when I talk about the history of roses and how they're related in ways that you've never thought to history and current events and past events, I think you'll be surprised at this rose. This rose is called Joanna Millar, and I received an email from her stepson. And this was his email. He said, many years ago, Joanna was visiting the famous horticultural gardens of La Martola at Ventimiglia, just on the Italian side of the border with France, and she spotted this unusual rose. No one seemed in a position to answer any of her questions about where it did come from or who bred it, and there was no one there to ask about taking cuttings, which is actually the best thing. If there's nobody to ask, that means you can take all you want. So she surreptitiously took a few cuttings, and one of them survived and took root in her garden at La Prieure. It's since climbed all the way to the top of an evergreen tree that looks to me like a juniper. More recently, she returned to La Mortola, which had apparently not been well looked after in the interim, and there was no sign of the rose there at all. She believes that her example is therefore the only survivor of the original in the world, and so she's tried to spread it around as much as possible. I think she wanted to name it La Mortola, but she got overruled and it was named after her, which seems very fitting. I hope that is helpful. Okay, now how does that connect to San Diego? Well, her son-in-law owns a bed and breakfast in Virginia, and that's where he wanted to have one of these plants, and I was able to get him one. But he sent me this follow-up email, and he said, John, I attach a few documents showing San Diego connections for Joanna's late husband, John H. Millar. About 1936, he became a good friend of Major Reuben Fleet, the owner of Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego, which is now General Dynamics. And when he returned to the UK, he persuaded a very reluctant British government to buy 5 Consolidated Catalina flying boats. Before the war, and one of those 5 was responsible for calling in the airstrike that crippled the Bismarck. If she hadn't been destroyed, the war could have gone very differently. Fleet asked Millar whether he should go ahead and build the B-24 Liberator bomber on spec, and Millar was the only person that told him to go ahead, which he did. Years ago in the Virgin Islands, I took a short ride on a Catalina, quite an experience. I don't know if there are any still flying, but that aircraft was crucial to winning World War II, so I think San Diego should have one on prominent display. In 1970, I built, with creative financing, as I didn't have any money, and he was only like 18 or 19 years old, a full-size operational copy of the 24-gun British frigate Rose, whose attempts to wipe out Rhode Island's only industry, the rum trade, caused Congress to found the American Navy to get rid of her. That ship, now renamed Surprise, is on permanent display at the Maritime Museum of San Diego. I hope you've been to see her. So isn't that amazing how much you can learn about history from a rose that a woman took cuttings of because no one was around? This is another one of my favorite roses, Peggy Martin. Does anyone here grow Peggy Martin? If you don't, you should. First of all, you need a little bit of room, but it doesn't mind being cut back. But this is referred to as the Hurricane Katrina rose. And the reason is it spent 2 weeks under salt water when the levees flooded some of the areas of New Orleans. And when the waters receded, this rose was fine. So it was a found rose to begin with, and Peggy had been given cuttings from someone who had gotten it from her mother-in-law, and she grew it at her house. But because the rose survived and was so healthy, she thought that everybody should grow it. And so people have started growing it. I wish the story was all good news. Peggy's parents lived next door to her, and they both died in the flood. But the rose did survive. The Zangerhausen Rose Garden in East Germany is the world's largest rose garden. It has about 8,000 different varieties of roses. During the Cold War, there was no passing of rose material between the East and the West. So Zangerhausen, instead of getting in new roses, they just kept propagating the roses they had there in the garden. And as a result, when the Iron Curtain came down and the Berlin Wall came down, people went into Zangerhausen, and roses they thought had been extinct for years were thriving and doing really well at Zangerhausen. This is a picture of Greer Garson and Wallaceberry? It looks like W.C. Fields, but it's not. But anyway, it's a scene from a movie called Mrs. Miniver. So Mrs. Miniver was also a rose, and there was an article in a London newspaper called "The Wartime Rose That Almost Vanished Forever." This gentleman here, Orlando Murren, is probably responsible for having this rose still alive today. And I'll tell you the background to that story. Joel mentioned about, Elaine mentioned about how I have a library with a lot of rose books. And this was a catalog that I happened to have. And it was the fall 1944 Jackson and Perkins catalog, and it had Mrs. Miniver on the front cover as a new rose that was being introduced. But Orlando remembered it from his youth, and he wanted to get this rose again. So he looked all over, found out that it wasn't available anywhere in the world. The only garden that listed it at one time that he could find was Zangerhausen in Germany. So he contacted Zangerhausen, and they said, we did have a rose, but it died. So we don't have it anymore. However, we do know where it came from. And they found an old gentleman still alive, not too far from from Zangerhausen, that still had this in his garden. So John and Becky Hook got cuttings from it, and they were able to start plants for Orlando, give him a plant that he had wanted for a long time. And then Becky contacted me and said, here's the story, here's a copy of the article in the London newspaper, would you be interested in one? Well, that was a silly question, because of course I was. And so we got one. This is just a list of roses that, and it's not a complete list, but it's a bunch of roses that Zangerhausen has that do not exist in the United States. But we, the Coastal Rose Society, just purchased all these from Zangerhausen, which is really exciting, but not as exciting as how difficult it's going to be to get them here. I haven't figured that out yet, but we do own them, and they are in France. Hopefully someday they'll be here. We've done some domestic rescues. One is with Vintage Gardens in Sebastopol. I'm sure many of you bought roses in the past from Vintage. They used to have up to 4,000 varieties that they offered, and of course they're one of the nurseries that now has gone out of business. And that's what their gardens used to look like. They don't look anything close to that anymore because rose gardens are not easy to maintain, and that's why a lot of public rose gardens are having problems because there's no public financing for labor to keep the garden going. So what Greg Lowry, the owner of Vintage, decided to do was to take his collections and move them to different parts around the state. And he gave the Coastal Rose Society the Hybrid Tea and Floribunda collection. So we have about 1,000 of those roses that we're holding, and we're propagating those, trying to get them back into gardens, and some of those will be in the auction coming up. That's Greg right there, and again, what his garden used to look like. Anthony Eglin, who some of you have probably read, is a great mystery writer, and he writes garden mysteries. If you haven't read any of his books, really get one. I mean, they're easy to read. They're kind of like Michael Crichton, Jurassic Park type books. They're real easy to go through, but they're filled with facts. They're horticulturally correct. And his first book was called The Blue Rose Mystery. I think The Blue Rose, an English Garden Mystery, which is a great story. And I was impressed because I know rose companies, and he had everything that he told you about a rose company was 100% true, except for the evil rose company that he made up. But everything else was true, and it was a great story. Well, Greg Lowry discovered roses on Alcatraz. And one of the roses that he discovered on Alcatraz was a rose called Bardoux Job, which did not exist in the United States, and he traced it back and was all excited that he was able to bring it back to the United States. Well, Anthony Eglin read the newspaper account of that story, and he wrote a book called The Alcatraz Rose, which is completely fictitious, of course, but still has some of that background in it. So real interesting if you want a book to read, and very easy to read. This is a picture of the rose Bardu-Job, and Job might seem like a weird name, but it's actually the owner of the company's name was Joseph Bardu, and his logo was his initials JB with a diamond in the center. So it looked like the word job or Job. So the rose is called Bardu-Job. Anyway, really pretty. It is ever blooming. A lot of old roses aren't, but this particular one is. And it's a small climber, or it can also be trained as a tall shrub. Here's something else it touches my heart. This was a card that Nancy Burning gave to her mother-in-law on her birthday. And Nancy had contacted me a month before her mother's birthday, and she said, "My mother's name is Carol Amling, and I see that you have a Carol Amling rose. Can you tell me where to get one?" Well, my answer was nowhere in the world. But we'll see if we can start one. And she told me about her mother's birthday coming up, and I said, you know what I can do is I will try to put some roses in a vase, put it in a box, and I'll airmail it to you, second-day air, and hope that it gets there in good condition. So this picture up here is actually a picture of what she received. And she gave that to her mother-in-law with this card, and it said, "Happy 90th birthday, Mom. In honor of your very special birthday, here's a small bouquet of your roses, the beautiful, delicate, and fragrant Carol Amling rose. In addition, the person from whom I got these roses will be sending Carol Amling rose cuttings on to 2 fellow gardeners in the spring of 2021 who will graft the cuttings to create a few more Carol Amling rose bushes. My hope is that these rose bushes will be enjoyed by years to come by your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond, and that when we all look at these roses, we'll be reminded of you and the loving way you raised your family. God's blessings on your 90th, Mom. Love, Bill and Nancy." There's Nancy and her mother-in-law, Carol Amling. One of the touching things to me about it was that Nancy said that her mother-in-law had the beginnings of dementia, and she was withdrawing into herself. And she said, but she comes alive when you mention her rose and you start talking about her rose. She remembers when her dad named it for her in 1950. And you can see the look on Carol's face, how happy she is just to be holding that particular rose. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to start new plants yet. We're still working on it. You guys can have cuttings of my plant if anyone here wants to try it. But I would like to get them some plants soon. Descanso Gardens, I know a lot of you have been to Descanso in La Cañada. They used to have magnificent rose gardens. They were the only garden I know in the United States that had a collection of Japanese roses. They're now gone. Everyone has been plowed under except for one. They used to have collections of roses by country. Those are pretty much gone. The garden's in disrepair. And since that was the only place in the United States you could find Japanese roses, had we not been contacted to take cuttings from those roses wouldn't exist in the U.S. anymore. The most famous Japanese rose breeder was Seizo Suzuki, who was a medic during World War II. And he also had a rose nursery prior to going into the Navy. He received a lot of criticism during World War II because his nursery was still growing roses, and people said, "You're growing the enemy's flower. You know, you should be growing chrysanthemums, or at the very least food, because they relate to Japan, not roses." But he continued to grow roses, and after the war ended, they went back, and the city that he was in hosted a rose show and a rose festival to be a healing between the U.S. and Japan. So Rendan is one of his roses, which we had in the auction last year. Sakura gasumi. Sakura in Japanese means cherry blossom, and gasumi means lots of them. So that's what that rose looks like when it blooms. And again, these are all roses that we now have in our collection. Alzora is a really pretty hybrid tea that was a cross with sterling silver, and kind of resembles sterling silver. Lady Beauty puts out tons of roses that look exactly like that. They're not much bigger than mini flora size, but look really cool and just always in bloom. Awayuki is the only rose that is still at Descanso that was a Japanese rose, and it's just masses and masses of bloom. It's when that's in season. Princess Chichibu was not a Japanese rose, even though it was named after a Japanese woman, and I love this rose. I think I first loved it because of the name. Just try saying Chichibu to yourself without smiling. But Princess Chichibu came under a lot of criticism during World War II because she sided with the Allies against the Japanese. So had I not seen the rose Princess Chichibu, I wouldn't even know who she was, let alone anything about her background. Emiko, again, is not a Japanese rose, but it's a rose that I bred. It was a cross between Martine Guillot and Arthur Bell, and was named after Bruce and Sharon Asakawa's granddaughter, Emiko. And the reason I named it after her was because when she was a young child, like about a little bit under 2, we went to visit them in Trieste, Italy, and Emiko hated men and would not go anywhere near a man, except she loved me and let me hold her, and I think that might say something about me, but I'm not sure what. The Buddha Teteni Rose Garden, we were contacted by Gabor Baranke, who was the curator of the Rose Garden, and he said, you know, we really lack public funding. I'm concerned because many roses, we have the last one in the world, and we need to somehow save them. Is there anything you can do to help? Again, you can't bring roses from Hungary into the US, but you can send cuttings from Hungary to France, and John and Becky did root some for us, so we were able to get some of those roses into the US. Buddha Teteni took the collection of Gergely Marx roses. He was the most famous rose breeder in Hungary, and actually one of the world's most famous rose breeders. He bred over 800 roses, and a lot of his roses never made it outside of Hungary, so people didn't know about them until Cliff Orant tried to import some of his roses, and he was able to do so. One of his roses that we've had on auction and we have in our collection is Fra Diavolo, which translates out of the Italian to Brother Devil, because if you're interested, you can Wikipedia him and read about him. But apparently he led an Italian resistance against the French when Napoleon was attacking some of the Italian states. Gandhi is a floribunda, one of Gergely Marx's polyanthus. And I love the color on it. It's kind of a deep apricot with russet overtones, and really looks pretty and puts out those huge sprays. I think it's going to make a great exhibition rose in the polyantha class if anyone besides me can ever grow it. That's another one of Mark's roses, Boder Peter Emlica. Emlica is the Hungarian equivalent of the French souvenir. And souvenir in French, like souvenir de la Montmaison, means in memory of the gardens at Montmaison. Emlica means the same thing, in memory of. So this rose was named in memory of Peter Boder. This is probably Mark's most famous rose right now in the U.S., St. Elizabeth of Hungary. It blooms like that, just with hundreds of blooms. It's a large growing rose. You can keep it cut back if you want. It's fragrant. And St. Elizabeth was famous for what's called the miracle of the roses. And she was royalty, but she was alive during the time of Francis of Assisi. And she believed a lot of his beliefs and how it was that you shouldn't keep worldly things to yourself, but they should be shared with the poor. So she didn't go quite as far as him to give away all her things, but she was giving away some of the things in the palace to the poor people. And she was making a trip into the town with a load of bread that she was carrying when she came across a hunting party who suspected that she was going to take things from the palace and give them to the poor people. So they asked her to open her cloak and show what it was she was hiding. So she opened her cloak, this is the story, opened her cloak, and out fell red and white roses. And somehow they turned back to bread later on, and she gave those to the poor people. I'm just putting this in because one of the things that I think stops people from saving older roses is all the new introductions that are coming along. And a lot of the newer roses are great roses, but you know, there's a rose called Knockout, which is on the East Coast. And to me, Knockout's not a rose. I would call it a flowering shrub. There's nothing wrong with it. If you want to grow flowering shrubs, that's fine, but just don't call them roses. However, that's where the money is today. If you want to make money, you make money in roses that can be used in landscaping. Well, Ping Lim is taking that concept of landscape roses, but instead of shrub form to the flowers, he's putting hybrid tea forms onto shrubs, and he's calling them hybrid tea shrubs. So Ping's roses, if you want to grow those, I'll come to your house and look at them. They're very nice. They're disease-free. They've got good form. They're in bloom all the time. They don't need spraying for the most part. They're easy to grow, and they're readily available. You can even get them at Lowe's. I think Ping sells them online. I'm going to contact Ping if Joel reminds me and see if he'll donate some to the auction. This rose we're going to have in the auction thanks to Bill and Elaine for the first time. It's a floribunda called John John. It's not available. Linda, you have this rose? No? It's not available anywhere, but when John F. Kennedy Jr. died in the plane crash, it was my idea to name a rose after him. So I contacted Tom Caruth at Weeks and said, could we name a rose after JFK Jr.? And he said, not really. It's going to take too much time. By the time we get permission, it'll be a couple years. No one will care by then. And I said, well, what about if we called it John John? He said, oh, yeah, there's no problem calling it John John. So for 1 year, Armstrong's carried this rose, which is a beautiful floribunda. He called it John John. And those of you who aren't as old as me might not realize that's John John right there with his dad, President Kennedy, above him. And I was looking for this rose for probably 10 years to be able to get cuttings, to be able to offer it again. And finally we have it. So I will have one, and hopefully one of you will have one also in your garden. I think it'll make good sprays for exhibiting too. I found a quote from John F. Kennedy Jr., which I thought was kind of interesting. And it goes with the previous picture. He said, "I can remember playing under the big wooden desk in his office. My mother didn't like us to chew gum, so we'd go into his office and he'd feed us gum under the desk." Lavender spoon's another rose that exhibitors really like. It wins a lot. It does not grow well on its own roots, so it needs to be grafted. Burling Leong from Burlington Roses donated this one, grafted on pink clouds, and we'll have this in the auction. Okay, last slide. I know everybody's getting anxious to go home, but who will save the roses? I hate to burden you guys, but it's actually everyone in this room. And if it's not you guys, it's not going to be anyone. So thanks so much for your time and attention. I really